Hi everyone. My name is Knoke. I've met some of you. I'd like to formally welcome you to the 5th Annual Political Networks Conference and Workshops. It's great to have you all here in Boulder, and it's great to see a lot of new faces and see a lot of familiar faces. I just wanted to take a quick moment to, before we begin the plenary, to say a few thanks and to make just a few announcements. For those of you just getting in, there's an updated program available on the conference website, and there will be a short reception in the Wolf Lock courtyard after Professor Knoke's talk, so just outside where we came from. A few thanks, very quickly. One to my co-host, Seth Maskin, at the University of Denver, as well as to the program committee, Jen Victor and Alex Montgomery. We'd also like to thank the trainers for putting on another year of great workshops. Steve Borgatti, Carter Butts and his team, James Fowler, Michael Haney, David Knoke, and Christian Steglich. David just finished teaching, as many of you know, and is turning around to give this address, so we really appreciate it and are very honored to have him here with us. We'd also like to thank the National Science Foundation for its continued support of the workshops. Yeah. Couldn't resist. And within that, thanks to John Schultz for overseeing the grant again this year, and to Skylar Cranmer for heading up this year's fellowship committee. Here at Colorado, a lot of people to thank. First of all, the Center to Advance Research and Teaching in the Social Sciences. Special thanks go to several of our graduate students in the Department of Political Science: Adam Caton, Tom Cook, Jeff Lyons, Andy Miller, Joby Schaefer, and Stefan Wojcik. And Jeff, Annie, and Stefan have been instrumental in making this happen. If you get a chance, say thanks to them when you see them around. A couple of them are on the market, too. So. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Ken Vickers, the outgoing chair of our department. Ken has been a great chair and played a key role in helping me secure funding to host this event here. So I'm very happy to turn the stage over to Ken, and who will introduce our first 2012 plenary speaker, David Knoke.
So Anand gave me some remarks I'm supposed to read. It says here, Anand Soki is the most awesome political scientist in the entire history of the University of Colorado Boulder, to come from the Ohio State University, not to be confused with those others, Denison College, and the entire Cincinnati Metroplex. So I think we should give a round of applause to Anand. Actually, he didn't give that to me to read. It's my privilege to introduce the speaker this evening, who is David Knoke. David is a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. In his distinguished and really quite prolific career, he has made numerous contributions in the areas of organizations and work, economic sociology, methods and statistics, and of course, social networks. David is the author or co-author of more than 15 books, including the forthcoming book, Economic Networks. He's also the author or co-author of countless peer-reviewed articles, several score actually, which have appeared in top sociology, political science, and methods outlets. His work has been published and is cited across the entire range of the social and behavioral sciences. David's current research focuses on a diverse set of networks, including intra- and inter-organizational healthcare, economic, financial, and terrorist and counter-terrorist networks. The latter is the subject of his talk today, entitled "It Takes a Network, Fighting Terrorists and Insurgents in the 21st Century." Please join me in giving David a very warm welcome.
It's wonderful to see so many political scientists getting excited about networks. And there's another group that's also has been excited about networks, and that's the U.S. military. So as you can see, General McChrystal has crystallized the saying of network to defeat a network. So we're going to look first at the networks that they're trying to defeat, and then look at the networks that the military is developing, proposing to use, has tried to use, and consider whether that's really an effective way to fight terrorists and particularly insurgents in the 21st century. So this phrase that I quoted there at the beginning comes from an article that McChrystal published last year, and shortly after he was ousted for impolitic remarks in Rolling Stone. He analyzed the Taliban. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I hope this was circulated to people in advance if you want to take a look at it later. But he calls the Taliban more a network than an army and says we've got to meet them on their own terms. We can't fight conventional warfare. We've got to figure out how to become a network process system itself. Now, he just didn't invent this out of nowhere. This has a history to it, but it's a fairly short history. And the enthusiasm with which the counterinsurgency, COIN, you'll hear that term quite often, has promoted this, developed it, it's become the orthodoxy, it's in the manuals, it's in the training programs, is quite startling how quickly this developed. And I think somewhat out of desperation of the situation that happened around the middle of the past decade when George Bush discovered mission wasn't accomplished. And tried to find a way out of that, at least a face-saving way to do it. So let's keep that in mind as we go along. If you've paid close attention to developments in military strategy and the counterinsurgency terrorist, if you're involved in the field, and I've only been doing this for about 5 years, mostly as an undergraduate instruction course, so that most of my knowledge comes from not direct research, but from lots of reading and teaching and pondering. This won't be unfamiliar to you. If you're only a casual headline news paying attention to the situation since 9/11, actually much before that, this may come as some insight that you weren't aware of. But there's the quote at the bottom of the article, and he drew this little network diagram. It has to do with asymmetric warfare. Warfare between equal forces involving unconventional strategies and tactics designed to exploit the opponent's weaknesses. Analysts have often talked about 3 different types of asymmetric warfare in the 21st century: terrorism, insurgency, and guerrilla war. Guerrilla war is the one I think is most easily distinguished because it involves uniformed forces. I think of Che Guevara and his ventures in Bolivia is a good example of that, where they were working as conventional military forces, ambushing, raiding, sabotaging against government forces. Civilians weren't really a target. But when you look at terrorism, insurgency, it's sometimes difficult with, and there are 100 definitions of both of these things, somewhat difficult to distinguish the two. And as I've been teaching this course, increasingly don't really pay much attention to the difference between the two and just treat them as sort of maybe ends of a continuum there between the two. And it's often very hard to tell, even within the recent Mideast, whether we're dealing with militias, insurgents, terrorists operating in the countries. They collaborate with each other, they blend in. Sometimes they'll fight as militias and sometimes just use hit and run terrorist tactics. But regardless of the forms engaged, they're often employing very similar social organization structures and tactics, and several researchers have graphed networks. And I'm only going to go through these quickly. My intention is not to focus so much on the nature of the terrorist and insurgency networks as it is to set that as the background against which McChrystal says it takes a network to defeat a network, and so these are the networks they're trying to defeat. We have examples from South America with the Colombian paramilitaries, in this case it's the right wings, that are fighting against left-wing organizations. We have Mark Sageman, one of the earliest graphs of the global Salafi movement, which he identified 4 positions with the central staff, and right smack in the middle, of course, is OBL. And I don't know to what extent this is really a real network or just a schematic. I think he does have a data set, but whether he used this to actually draw this diagram or it's just sort of indicative. But there are others that have done it with individuals. Here's, based on websites and media reports, the 11 different Sunni insurgent groups in the Operation Iraqi Liberation. Oh, wait a minute, that spells oil. Iraqi Liberation, Operation Iraqi Freedom. to be more precise. Anyhow, as you can see, there's lots of collaboration, apparently even just on the websites between these groups or contacts. Here's some. I don't have any idea where the data source is. It's neat though, because there are pictures of all these folks. It's more than 52 player deck, 52 card deck. This is a group that's promoting a visualizer software, but they have it. There's Zarqawi, whose network we're going to look at shortly here. I think that's bin Laden down in the middle, and so on. You can blow up and look at each of these things, and there's a descriptive data on all of these. Here's the Zarqawi network. The one that Bush said that we had to go in to fight. It actually formed after we went in, because it drew a lot of people into the theater, because it could actually kill Americans in the field. But this is the one that Colin Powell said exists, headed by Musab al-Zakari. His eventual capture and kill is an interesting network story in itself, but we'll look more at the one about Saddam Hussein, because I don't have the full information on that. There are insurgencies that are family businesses, the Haqqani network in Pakistan and Afghanistan, one of the major ones. I've heard military people just recently saying they're our major foe in this field, enemy number one. A lot of the pictures aren't known, but this is really a family tree as well as an organizational network. You have software where a couple of freelancers have used this software to show the connections between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They live in Afghanistan, so they know some of these folks, talk to them. Dissertation by Khoshadi that graphed a cell, an operation between Jama'a Ismailiyah cell that bombed the Bali nightclub 10 years ago, and points out there was one key go-between between the people who were the active members who carried out the bombing versus those that had done the planning and the construction of the suicide vest. We have Palestinian suicide networks that were documented inside 4 cities in the occupied territories. We have a Jewish underground network which targeted Palestinians and assassinated Prime Minister Rabin because of their opposition to the Oslo Accords. All of these are just examples of networks with the conventional 2-dimensional figures where you have points and lines and you can see various structures, cut points, key points, clusters, and so forth. And so many people have gotten into this business. I wish there were a lot more. Some of this is fairly descriptive and not so much analytic. The grandfather of all these is Valdez Krebs' story. There's a fascinating story we don't have time to go through, but you can visit his website where he reconstructed the 9/11 hijacker network on the next slide after the fact from public information. So this is stuff that's reported in the newspaper. Journalists dug it up and reported about who was living with who in Hamburg and that sort of thing, who was training. There's a nice Minnesota connection here. Some people thought that the 20th hijacker didn't make it because he was apprehended. I don't think so, but nevertheless, people have wondered why were there 19 instead of 20. But there was a situation where 2 of these hijackers had been seen by the CIA. The CIA failed to pass on this information when they returned back into the United States, and the dots were never connected. Questionable, though, whether if they had known that, would that have been the case as well or not. But here's the diagram that Krebs came up with, and there are several people currently, this last month, went to trial for this crime in Guantanamo. At this point, well, one last comment. Networks have been touted as just wonderful, that the more you network, the better you can get along in your career, the more resources you have, access to timely information, you can work up projects and collaborations with people. Networks are just ducky. And we don't often stress the liabilities of networks, the dark side of the networks. There are just a handful of people who've mentioned this, and I'm convinced that there should be more, because networks can be confining, constraining, and restricting, as well as liberating and productive of all kinds of social capital. There are social liabilities to go along with that. But at least some of the people in this subfield of terrorism have acknowledge that. And I particularly like Seth Jones. I'd read almost anything he publishes because he's very well informed. He's got good contacts and he has lots of interesting ideas, great data sets he's worked on, and so on. This particular article disputes all of these advantages that networks allegedly have of efficiency, scalability, adaptability, and so on. And they point out that they often will create more liabilities than they solve. Just to mention a few of them, compartmentalization, cell structure means that you can't have everybody in contact with everybody in the organization because that makes it very vulnerable. So that prevents information from flowing. Local cell decisions aren't reviewed by higher ups, so you get a wacko like Zarqawi, hothead who wants to run off and create a spectacular, which could be counterproductive to the organization of which they're part. There's often kinship and network, ethnic-based relationships. They can slow the group's ability to expand rapidly because you don't trust people outside your tribe. Of course, this prevents some infiltration, but it often acts as a barrier to expanding the scale and scope. There can be infighting between factions of the groups as these networks decentralize. Some groups will be at odds with others, and if they suspect somebody has been infiltrated or can turn against. That's a good counterterrorism tactic, to arrest somebody, hold them, and then just release them back in the public along with a rumor that this person has talked, and then just watch the cell structure self-destruct. And so, as well as it is an opportunity for people to infiltrate and dismantle. I think there was a recent example of that in the last couple of months that came out, that Stuxnet's virus that was helped to damage some of the Iranian nuclear power plant operations was put in place by an infiltrated person who was able to do that. Now, I want to turn to, in the remaining of this time, and I'll leave some time at the end of this talk to take questions, turn to the adoption of a network approach to counterinsurgency by the U.S. military, trace out some of the origins of that, some of the way it's been applied, and then end up with some of the cautions that come out of that. So the first appearance of this approach is really not what we think as counterinsurgency, but I mention it because that's the earliest link I could find to this. Network-centric warfare was something that the U.S. Navy in the 1990s propagated a shift from platform-centric to network-centric strategies, that is, trying to coordinate operations by various units of the military, and they were using computers and information technology that can allow the military commanders to shift from this massive attrition-style warfare, which was characteristic of Vietnam. Remember, we're going to bomb it back into the Stone Age by just dropping lots of ordnance on the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and try to use this advantages of the satellite linkages, technologies, ability to talk across various kinds of platforms to integrate. I mean, remember 9/11 had a counter. Not the rescuers had trouble communicating because the cops and the firefighters didn't even have equipment that could speak to each other. And I'm thinking you would think they had to recognize and needed to work out. I don't know what turf battles got in the way of that. But this was an attempt to do this kind of integrated warfare. So it's more conventional in a sense, but at least it refers to networking the counterinsurgency side of it, and offers a lot of advantages over doing large-scale conflicts over long distances, at least allegedly. And as far as I can discern, that was part of the approach that Rumsfeld put in place when he became Secretary of Defense right before 9/11. This is, Bush is elected in 2000, takes office in February, February of 2011. I'm messing things up here. 2001, 8 months before 9/11. Well, the operation in 9/11 on the terror side was underway for 2 years. At that point, it had been about a year and a half in running. So Rumsfeld is spending a lot of money to build up the military and the so-called revolution in military affairs to build this network-centric approach. But it's still very massive, still very top-down, highly integrated and coordinated. And as a result of doing that, he is the architect of the invasion of Iraq and going in with a light footprint, very rapid mobile forces, coordinated, knock down all the barriers, get to Baghdad, and not thinking about what it would take to have an occupation later. Shinseki basically was forced out or retired, resigned effectively because he objected to that. He said, you need 3 times as many. You don't need this 170,000 man occupying army. You need 500,000 at the minimum to do that. And he lost that argument. And we and the people on the ground paid the price for that. So this is still, this approach to network-centric warfare is still very much focused on the technology side of it, not the social side of it. The networks are really referring to technological networks. And it's useful for knocking Saddam Hussein's Scuds out of operation, but it's not useful for defeating a social network sustained many modern insurgencies. So let's make the distinction between modern and classical insurgencies and what they're up against that's different from, in my day, Vietnam was the insurgency that everybody thought was the classic example. They had borrowed these techniques from the Chinese who defeated the nationalists in the 1940s, and they applied this, and it was sometimes called the Cuban model, sometimes called the Chinese model, and so on. I'm just going to use the word Maoist because, well, the sources I'm looking at refer to that as Maoist, as opposed to the jihadist insurgency. So Mao says the guerrilla moves among the people as fish swim in the sea. You know, dry up the sea, and they have no place to swim. They'll be exposed, and you can defeat the guerrilla that way. But this is a hierarchical military command structure. There's a top-down, the classical structure, commander-in-chief. You've got divisions, you've got battalions, you've got platoons, and so forth. It's fully integrated with a political hierarchy. In their case, it's a communist hierarchy, the left-wing hierarchy. You mobilize and indoctrinate the local populace. You cut them off from the government. You eliminate all the local governments. You arrest them. You execute them. You hold territory. That's a big difference there. Holding territory, trying to basically take over from the countryside and eventually the urban centers, and defeat the regime in a conventional warfare. If you remember Castro, I remember Castro because that happened when I was a child. Castro goes into Havana. He starts off in the mountains and he works his way down and he rolls into town, and Batista flees. And so it's a military victory in the end, a classical kind of insurgency. The jihadists, and particularly focusing on Iraq, are deploying contrasting structures and tactics, shifting the network of militant organizations with low social cohesion. The groups are many small cells, sometimes a couple of people, 3 people, no centralized structure, leadership, no political control over the military. There's no political politburo, political commissars, I should say, over observing and counterdicting military actions. There's no political program for mobilizing the population. They're not trying to hold territory. It's not clear what they really think they can achieve with this method, but nevertheless, that's how they operate. They use effective information technology, cell phones, the internet. You know, the biggest weapon, the worst weapon that the occupiers faced in Iraq was the IED, which basically involves a garage door remote control. So there's very little sense of a massive collective centralized action, unlike the Maoist counterinsurgency program. And so there's an aim to drive out the occupying forces, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. The immediate goal of the insurgency is to get the foreign occupiers, NATO, the United States, the Central Coalition forces, out of the nation without regard to anything about a long-term situation. While the Americans and the coalition forces are out of Iraq, and I don't see anything happening in terms of a counterterrorism in a Maoist kind of sense. So maybe that is the vulnerability of the jihadist method. Classical counterinsurgency then depends on fighting the centralized hierarchical guerrilla structure by doing what Mao said, drying up the sea of the people so they can't operate freely and with impunity. It was tried in Vietnam with the Phoenix program of assassinating local Viet Cong operatives, depriving them of support of the population. The British was successful. Everybody loves this case. The British is successful in Malaysia. They took them about 10 years, but they defeated a rebellion, one of the few cases where a clear victory, by moving the Chinese Malays into new villages. The U.S. tried to do that, replicated in Vietnam with the strategic hamlets, and it didn't succeed. The initial counter-insurgency effort in Iraq was to capture and kill leaders of al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. If you remember how they spelled it in the Daily Show, it was Mesopotamia, and that's what it turned out to be, literally. It didn't succeed. It was decentralized enough that you couldn't find a few key leaders and eliminate them and pull them out, unlike where you could in a Maoist kind of insurgency. Self-organizing insurgents are resilient to picking off and can quickly recruit new militants and reorganize and go on from there. There's a good example of a recommendation of trying this by this a group of 89 analysis of 89 insurgency following World War II, where the recommendations are based on the premise that it's a contest for the allegiance of the population. Victory is not just winning a military conflict, but persuading Islamic populations to choose the legitimate government. So the idea, again, is that you have to do this with a social component in mind, a political social component. It's not simply enough to defeat militarily on the battlefield the insurgents themselves, but you have to, again, switch the allegiance of the population over to the weight over to the government. And that was what was tried in initial Iraqi occupation, our occupation of Iraq. So now we come down to seeing the light, being converted, military switches over to network thinking. And they're getting all these ideas, I think, from social scientists. I think they're reading, because I know the sources they're citing and the people they seem to be talking to and getting advice from are network analysts, people like Seth Jones and others, not me, but they're getting some input from well, anthropologists, sociologists perhaps, political scientists. So by the middle of the occupation, the middle of the decade, it had deteriorated into a morass of ethnic cleansing, civil war, insurgency, terrorism. Everybody was doing everything possible to create chaos, and it was very difficult for the military to respond by the conventional ways they were doing it. By late 2004, a group of soldiers, academics, and policymakers began crafting a new strategy and trying to pull lessons from these historical successes and failures, some of which I cited a moment ago. The two key figures in this, and really one key figure, is David Petraeus, along with his first co-author, General Amos. It's a military, it's an Army Marine, so you have a person for both services, counterinsurgency field manual. And this is just a wonderful, it's public available. All you have to do is Google it, and you can find copies. There was an earlier draft, and the earlier draft is somewhat different from the final version, but not a great deal. But this was quickly adopted. Petraeus is a charismatic military figure, and all the presidents want to have him on their side, serve with him. He's currently a CIA director. But at this time, he was basically developing a new strategy that he popularized in the counterinsurgency manual, and has these principles that he operationalizes in terms of the way we're going to train people, where we're going to conduct operations, and it will be something quite different. And it won't be the conventional counterinsurgency that you knew back in Vietnam. And as you note, I highlighted the bottom one, social network analysis, to gather and interpret intelligence on insurgents is a key component of this approach. But you see other elements of this: protect the population, build the nation, close contact, interact on a daily basis. Before, they've been sitting out in posts or in bases and going out on patrol, and at night they would retreat back to the bases. Now it was to have postings down in the neighborhood, and you get to become familiar, try to make friends, whatever that means in this context, with the locals, get them to tip you off about arms caches and people that they know are involved in the insurgency. And there's clearly what they don't like to call nation building, but effectively that's what it is here, often more valuable than conventional operations. So, social network analysis in the coin intelligence gathering operation. That's the most relevant part to support the larger counterinsurgency intelligence activities. Traditional social networks and irregular forces represent a crucial part of the source of intelligence. You've got to be able to tap into those and use them to your advantage. Get people to basically rat out their tribesmen, fellow tribesmen, their neighbors, their cousins, etc., and use this information to leverage all these sources so that self-defense and counter-terrorist irregulars can use to to secure remote areas and isolate the insurgents. So it's trying to shift the population's loyalties over to the side where they're providing you information, and then you can use that information to help coordinate local militias, local tribespeople, and the military of the country to work in a coordinated fashion to slowly cut off and isolate the insurgents and dry up their sources of support. You see the Canadian forces are very explicit about this, a schematic about how the intelligence inputs from a variety of sources, human, machine, geographic, signal, electronic, et cetera, all coming in, being collated and assessed by, oops, I don't want to switch that yet, social network representations, and then being fed back out into the actual intelligence support of the military operations. Where are these people located? Where can you expect to find them at this time of day? Who will be able to assist you in this? And also how to use that in a coordinated fashion by different units of the counterinsurgency operation. That is the people on the field, the people in the planning, people operating intelligence signal activities. How can they all work as a coordinated machine? That's the network that's being built on the counterinsurgency side of it. Here's examples from the manual using link analysis. These are all hypothetical; they're just made up names, but showing how to build a matrix. I mean, this is very elementary stuff. Everybody who went through Steve Borgatti's course on UCINet is already well beyond this level. But you're talking to people in military, people, graduates of academies that didn't have any of this as part of their training. They never heard of network analysis. And so it's just very elementary stuff. It's showing them what data collection and link analysis looks like and convincing them that this is going to be something you have to learn. This is part of your training. This is how you're going to actually apply it. It's applied network analysis in the service of fighting insurgencies. So let's see some examples of how they attempted to do this and how were they successful. There's an extended appendix B, which is part of this very basic stuff, but then also has some stories about how they were successful in using it. One of the most dramatic one is the hunt for Saddam Hussein. He was on the loose as Baghdad fell for up to a year. They kept looking for him here and there everywhere. He was the real weapon of mass destruction that they couldn't really find until they got serious about network analysis and set up a team that would collate all the data they could collect and search for more data and build network maps. And you'll see the example of the map, or you'll see the map that they built at the end, tracing very tiny steps. It was centered around Tikrit, his hometown, but he was being moved around from place to place and trying to find out who moved him and so forth. For example, we know that this is the way that they finally found Osama bin Laden, right? They were able to finally find out by a network analysis who was the courier that was physically traveling in and out of that compound, and then they were able to find out when he went to the compound and which compound it was. So this has been used several times. Here's an example of what they're saying that this is what Petraeus is saying will happen over time if you start to use this application. Eventually, you will break down a network until it is very fragmented, and then you can move in for the kill here. Easier to disrupt and kill. Here's the diagram. This is a diagram that I think it's Bruce Reed or Brian Reed. He was part of the team. He did this as part of a group effort, and then he wrote his dissertation in sociology. He was directed by my former, from 40 years ago, my former dissertation advisor shows up 40 years later doing this analysis here. So things have a way of coming back. Back then, neither of us knew anything about network analysis, but this is the links that they finally were able to pinpoint where he was and track him down in his spider hole and pull him out. And he said he was ready to negotiate at that point, as you recall. Don't shoot, I'm ready to negotiate. Both of the wars provided opportunities to implement these counterinsurgency principles that Petraeus had with a lot of input from academics and planners and people in the field. It's not his own effort, he didn't dream it all up, but he put it together and he created it as a manual that becomes now part of the training that goes into officers as they get into the services. Each of these counterinsurgencies had a troop surge. The first troop surge was in Iraq around 2006 when there was a political backlash. As you remember, the Democrats took over and Rumsfeld was let go quickly and Petraeus was put in charge of the counterinsurgency effort. There was a surge of troops, so they had extra bodies to do it. But how useful was this technique for detecting, disrupting, and decimating insurgency networks? You can look at this interesting talk that Petraeus gave a couple years later in Vanderbilt, where he talks about the anaconda strategy of squeezing in, where he doesn't quite come out and say it was a network approach, but he had this idea the points at which you're squeezing are these vulnerable points on the network. Other people have credited the Sunni awakening as a key part of that. So it wasn't just the surge alone. In fact, this happened after the Sunni awakening occurred. But this is one of the coin principles, the hearts and minds strategy of getting the people who are either on the fence or who have been actively supporting or favorable to the insurgency to come over to your side. And there was a misstep by Al-Qaeda. They started to implement Taliban principles of governing, of operating in the areas they were at, beheading people, chopping off hands, just basically anybody who wasn't for them was against them. And this heavy-handed approach alienated enough of the Sunni tribes that their leaders were receptive to going over and basically taking payment for Saddam militias and kicking Al-Qaeda out of the particularly in Anbar province in the western part of the country. So you can see some people say this is a decisive event. Without the counter insurgency component that went along with the troop surge, there wouldn't have been this sort of shift of gravity over to the point where the Al-Qaeda was on the run and the Sunni insurgencies quickly dampened down. I don't know the answer to this, whether it was the troop surge or possibly a combination of the two. We can't run the experiment a second time and figure it out. But it is enough things going on there to say that it could have been several things happening to be successful. And as we know, it was successful. It was successful under Bush. Obama continued to draw down, is completely out. We have these tens of thousands of contractors still on the ground that complicate matters, but nevertheless, the military aspect of Iraq is over. And the question about whether it's going to be the same situation in Afghanistan. Can it apply to Afghanistan? Petraeus says it's different. What we could do in an urban setting with a much more advanced, literate society than you can do in a rural countryside where you don't have the same kind of social structure, you don't have the same configuration of political interest. You have to do things differently there when you're operating in a village culture as opposed to when you're operating in an urban culture. There are many other dimensions he points out. But you do have to have this security presence, and it just has to be done differently. Okay, just a little bit more here. What about networks in Afghanistan? Several things are going on there. COIN expanded to building a true network. This is McChrystal's word, a true network by connecting everyone who had a role. He's talking about the counterinsurgency folks. There are different kinds of people in the military, different services, different units. You've got civilians. The State Department has a big presence in the country. Others that have to be brought into that. Needing to decentralize the approach so that local on-the-ground commanders can react quickly on their own without having to go up the chain of command and get approval and come back down. This had been an earlier problem where we're using drones. By the time they got approval, it was too late because the people had left the area and was no longer able to track where they were. Although Obama says he approves of all these things, but I don't think he's actually on the joystick. So I think there's just some discretion there. Otherwise, they have to act quickly. There's a human terrain system. There's a whole sub-story about that. Anthropologists were consulted on that in using traditional anthropological methods for trying to get the local culture better understood, to integrate some of the local populations with the military operations, as you see here. But the Anthropology Association got very distressed about that and disapproved of that because of the ethical violations it implies here, that you're asking scientists to act as counterinsurgents and be responsible for the dangers that occurs to, well, both the possible dangers to themselves as well as to the people in the conflict. And that program is over. There's the provisional reconstruction teams. I have a graduate student, I'm not directly supervising, but on our committee, who's doing a social network analysis of these. That's how I happen to know about it, otherwise I probably wouldn't. But there was a tripartite USAID, State Department, and military. And the military, she says, is really controlling the operation. It's not a group of equals, but it is an intentional network. It has its problems because it never really gels as a network. But the idea was to bring all of these civilian aid and military components together in each of these provinces and set up a localized, locally tailored, each one looks different from the others because of the local situations. But that apparently has been less than fully successful, at least as intended. Karzai, the president, says these groups and the private companies are going to have to leave as soon as the Afghans take over. What he doesn't tell you is how long it's going to take before the Afghans take over. Supposedly 2014, probably 2013 more likely, but I don't think they're prepared to take over at that time. They may be forced to. Caveat reticulum. That is Latin for, caveat emptor, beware the buyer, beware the network. All right. The core objective is to identify, the intelligence functions to identify and ultimately remove or disable the key actors in an insurgent terrorist network. That's what it means to fight a network with another network, is to get that network, generating the intelligence, making it timely, applying it precisely in a way that allows you to reduce the effectiveness of the insurgency or the terrorist networks. In the short-term success, there are long-term issues and problems, just as Seth Jones was arguing about the limitations of networks. For example, the Tamil Tigers. That's a tragic classic case of insurgency that was wiped out by conventional military means, and what's left in place is not very much to build on. That country, that society is going to be suffering for generations because of the way that war was fought here. McGinney says, I like McGinney because he really brings these out and hammers them precisely, point after point. Network can be too successful. It can strip out all the movement cadre who could negotiate a peace. All right, so you decapitate all the key players, and there's nobody left over with the authority, the legitimacy, the ability to negotiate a peace. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you have to keep fighting because there's nobody that can cut a deal. People wonder if the Taliban have that kind of situation, or it's too factionalized to be able to do that. Assisted campaigns can fail to address the root causes. Well, I don't see that as really an effective rebuttal. Root causes, you're talking about stuff that goes back into ancient history. Why do the Sunnis and Shiites hate each other? There's not much you can do in an applied sense about that. And it's not clear that addressing the root causes, or even understanding what they are, is necessary to doing something at the present moment to deal with that. So I'm not too convinced that that's a handicap. But by removing social capital and entrepreneurs, may condemn communities to underdevelopment and failed post-war reconstruction. Being too successful with this. So the question is how far to go with this and how far to draw back and then say, okay, let's talk. Because there is again, a Seth Jones study based on all of the hundreds of terrorist groups that have operated in the post-war period, of pretty clear evidence that military has very limited role in ending terrorist campaigns qua insurgencies. There are just very few instances. I think the Tamil Tigers is a good example of one that was defeated, the Malaysian counterinsurgency and so on. But you see what's happening most of the time is policing, 40% policing. These are ones that actually have come to a conclusion. There's still hundreds of these going on. Or politicization, that is Northern Ireland, where you finally get enough weariness with the war that the parties see an advantage to sitting down together and working out their differences and negotiating a peaceful solution, a political resolution that restores some of the political rights. Now, if the British had wiped out the IRA, they probably couldn't have reached that. So they had just enough of a military pressure to show these folks, we're not going to leave. You can bomb all you want. You can assassinate, but we're not going to leave. We're going to stick here. But you do have this opportunity to get in some political advantages. It's half a loaf better than no loaf at all. And apparently that's what the conclusion of that is. So to wrap up, Irony, is it ironical that social network analysis assisted COIN, counterinsurgency, worsens the chance for political end to conflicts? It's an open question, but I think we can't be too enthusiastic just as because we love networks so much. Networks is a solution to everything. It has a tempered quality. There are limits, there are qualifications, there are constraints on which social network analysis can be serving both to fight a network and to defeat a network and to leave something in place for the post-conflict society to recover from and restore itself to a more conventional kind of political relationship. Thanks. I'll take some questions. We have about 10 minutes. Thank you. James?
So, when they talk about making a network with the military, this is an organization that's always had an org chart.
Yeah.
And a lot of the sort of way it seems like they're talking about it, it feels more like broadcasting peer-to-peer to me.
Ah.
So, I don't know, like, what do they mean when they say, like, we're going to create a network? Like, you have images of their, like, sharing information.
Yeah.
There's always been an effort for there to be a line of command where orders flow down, information flows up. So what's
Yeah, I think this is a hybrid. I think the intention is to graft onto that corporate vertical military structure, chain of command, some kind of lateral connection so that if you're, McChrystal's short piece, which is written for public consumption, is very interesting because it gives you some insight. He talks about situations that they use, or at least attempted to use this kind of approach in various operations in Iraq, so that you had a group that was on a night operation in Mosul up in the north someplace, and there were people that picked up information in other parts of the country. I'm not sure how they would get that, but they could get that timely information down to the troops on the ground who were going door to door and trying to roust out the local insurgents there. So I had this sort of sense that it wasn't replacing a hierarchy so much it was trying to establish, you had these silos between the Marines and then the Navy and the Air Force, et cetera, and so on. And even within that, different units that were operating in different territories, you're trying to break that down so that some of the cross connection could occur. That's the image I got from that. Now, I don't know if they were very successful in doing that, or there's still, I imagine there's still problems with that. Getting people to overcome their training, because most of the people who are implementing that have been trained in a whole different approach. All the people that went through West Point and Annapolis and so on, they all learned this other conventional strategy. Now so they have to unlearn it because Petraeus told them to. Yes.
I just wanted to throw out a couple of examples. One, in terms of just the negative effects, I thought was for the fourth military, which I don't really have a problem with it being a negative effect for them. But the Lady Gaga CD for Private Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks, basically that came from the fact that the military had shared a lot of their intelligence across all, actually, the State Department.
So what Manning leaked, was that a result of that?
Well, yeah, that's right, exactly. It was a result of the network information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other one, which is actually a bit more ties into your point, which is simply that I think that there's a long history in the military of wanting to have hybridized hierarchy with autonomy. And one of the ones I know about, and I don't know very well because I'm not an expert in military history, but in World War I, towards the end of it, there was this apparently a massive, very important shift in military strategy that moved from basically marching men out of the trenches and getting them all shot down by machine guns and giving autonomy to individual units and then using radio sets
Mm-hmm.
and then using terrain as sort of a major way to protect themselves from machine guns.
Right.
And that just strikes me as really like, you know what I mean? It's a move from broadcast, we want to get out, to
Right.
a network.
And that brings to mind something I didn't show you and talk about, but I do use in my class, which is another one of these Seth Jones articles, which is about how the Israelis used a networking approach to clean out the Kasbahs in various cities like Nablus and on the West Bank. This is sometime in the mid of the decade, where they used this kind of on-the-ground decentralized coordinated system to attack and force into the center where they could just kill off the insurgents. So there's an example of I think they were ahead. Maybe that's part of what the U.S. military was picking up on in doing this innovation. I would not be surprised if that fed into it. Yes?
So if the military is discussing so explicitly and publicly this sort of move to a more network type structure,
Yep.
have you had any dialogue on this in Congress or discussion of accountability or oversight operations or anything like that?
Geez, that's a good question. Really good question, because I say no, I haven't encountered it. Doesn't mean it isn't there. You know, there are some things that are secret. This whole business with the recent leak during the last couple of weeks here, where the Congress people, bipartisan for once, came out and said, you know, they have an investigation going on and so forth. You know, there's stuff that can be going on that we're not privy to. What really did surprise me is how open this is to public discourse. But then, you know, Petraeus is mainly a political soldier. I mean, he got where he was because he's very good at politics, and he was able to shape this reformation of the military in his own model because he was effective at communicating his ideas and persuading people to get on. He was a great networker himself to do this, and part of it is making it public. I think this is a deliberate strategy to talk about it, to have popularized pieces like McChrystal's written, where people can understand what is going on. Anybody could have done what I did. I don't have any privileged insight. I'm not a military expert. I don't study the military as part of my main academic interest, but I am interested in networks, and that's what led me into this. And I was just fascinated to see this. And this all happened just in a matter of a few years. And the question is this the wave of the future, or are some of these liabilities going to be uncovered, and there'll be some rethinking about that? When Petraeus retires and somebody else becomes the soldier of the day, is it going to go back? Will the pendulum swing? A lot of it depends on who are our next enemies. You know, if we go into Syria, that's probably more of a conventional warfare with tanks, airplanes, and so forth. But there may be other things lurking around that we don't know. We can't. 10 years ago, we had no idea we were going to be where we are before 9/11. And look where we are. So where are we going to be in another 10 years? The military has to plan for the future, though. It has to anticipate what might happen.
Is there any evidence that insurgent groups are changing their network structures to response?
Yeah, that would be fascinating, because clearly you could say there was a cause and effect in the sense of insurgents were operating in this new style, not the old Maoist style, but the new style, and that caused a reaction and a counter formation by the military. So you would think logically this would be the other step, that it would be iterations, a sort of an arms race of a kind between different approaches. Haven't picked up anything explicitly on that, but I think that's a good place to look to see if there's some way that the insurgents are trying to reformulate their own approach that would protect them from some of these problems. You and then back.
I think it's important to point out that another source of the metric networks and warfare actually comes out of the war on drugs.
Ah, good point.
Back in the 90s, there was more of an emphasis in policing institutions. We've been doing this in Colombia for years, and there is actually a literature that looks at that.
Yeah.
And I can suggest a couple things that might be helpful.
That'd be helpful. Yeah, please.
I raise it because it does have implications for this slide here. Because
Right.
there are some
Yeah, and I was aware of it. I just didn't include it, but thank you for reminding me that the so-called dark networks, there are many other kinds of clandestine networks besides insurgencies and terrorist groups that can be also approached in this way. Who was the one? Oh, yeah.
So I have sort of 2 points. One is a general one, but I think it's one of the problems with sort of very large announcements is that we have a linguistic problem. We have a narrative from the sociologists, so let's go ahead and blame it on.
Yeah, thanks.
Networks as an organizing method of organization versus hierarchies. We also refer to networks as a method of analyzing, which can also be used to analyze targets and hierarchy as well. And I think that many of the languages and terms that are used both commonly and in this presentation sort of go back and forth between these things. These are not, in fact, the same singular concepts. Sometimes organizing principles, sometimes some of the networks that you picked up look like hierarchies.
That's just how they're drawn.
So, although I have to say, that if this sociologists were working on this for so long, we wouldn't have all these nice tools and theories to steal from them. So
Yeah.
That's the first point. The second point is that, when I initially saw the title of your lecture, like, it takes an hour to defeat a network, I thought, oh, no, it doesn't. In fact, Michael Kenny, one of the things which he writes about in his book is that it really doesn't a lot of the time. But it seems that almost in conclusion from this overall presentation is that, well, most of the time it really doesn't. It may be useful that, have some information transfer back and forth. That'll be useful in some context, and that network analysis might be useful in very particular ways to want to hunt a particular person down to capture or kill them. But by and large, that this hypothesis has been unproven. More or less, it seems like something that the military says because it sounds nice. It's a good soundbite, but ultimately, this idea that either network analysis or network forms of organization, there's no proof that they in fact are good at defeating these types of dark networks.
But the old W.I. Thomas statement, things are true if people believe they're true. If they really are serious, if this is not just window dressing and PR, if they really think a network approach to counterinsurgency is an important element of the new counterinsurgency strategy, and they act that way, and they put people in the field and try to implement it and so on, it's real in its consequences whether it has an impact or not. I don't have an opinion about whether that was successful or not. For example, I couldn't judge between the Sunni awakening, where you paid people to come over to your side, versus doing a troop surge where the military had more boots on the ground, which of those was, if either, was important. It's just I was trying to expose the thinking of the military in this one special area, which was the last two wars we fought, our counterinsurgency, insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, and this is what they came to a solution after fumbling around for the first part of the decade with something else.
Yes, to follow up on that point a little bit, do you think that it's possible they're confusing 2 points, saying that it takes a network to defeat a network versus it takes social network analysis to defeat a network? I mean, I see a lot of
good point.
Like sort of overlap and sort of miscommunication, right? Because one's you're doing it to yourself, and the other you're analyzing them, right?
Yeah, I read McChrystal's statements. You have to go through the full thing, but even in the parts I quoted, I read him as not saying social network analysis is a tool that we can use to gather intelligence and work as the same old army did before to defeat a network. I read him as saying we need to create networks among people involved in this vast enterprise and coordinate their activities in a very timely fashion so that we can be effective in finding the bad guys and knocking them out. So I think he's saying it's network structure is what we're trying to create.
That's really important clarification that I was actually going to ask too, because it seems to me the first half of the presentation, when you're talking about the actual terrorist networks, that one of the key points is how dispersed they are, even though they've been able to accomplish a lot, right? They're sort of dispersed, and that makes information sharing difficult at times.
Yeah.
And so then if the military and the intelligence organizations are adopting that structure when they have significant barriers, I mean, there's reasons why it's hard to share this information, because it's hard to send an email even from the CIA to the DOD, right? Because it's all classified information, and it's really difficult to share information in that environment. And so it seems like if you're adopting that structure, then you're vulnerable in the same way that these terrorist organizations are.
You're pointing out liability, potential liability, the dark side of networks, and is the one possible scenario is as the military gets very good at working as a quick responding network in an insurgency environment, that the only protection the insurgents have is to fragment and disperse and become a bunch of loose actors, and then they lose their effectiveness. They can't coordinate anything. They have all these kind of issues of just staying alive, let alone having effective operations. One of the phenomena that's really happening inside the U.S. has been the rise of the wannabes, the lone wolf terrorists who are inspired by the internet. But some of them had some training, some just volunteered. They're inept, incompetent, but it only takes one instance of a spectacular to really. We saw how much the political culture of this country changed with the response to 9/11. We have very fewer civil liberties than we had before as a result of that. And in some sense, that was the real impact and victory of Osama was to create the climate of fear that allowed for this change in our civil liberties, not knocking down the buildings. I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. So somebody ask a nice upbeat question, and we'll wrap it up at that point, because we are over time here. Yeah.
Really what we're talking about is the decompartmentalization of our own.
Yeah.
People who are
Good way to put it.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. If it in fact is treated that way, I mean, we have to see whether a lot of these are sort of intentions and proposals, and we have to see whether they get implemented and to what extent, or they turn out not to be the solution they were looking for.
Seems like another point that you're implying is that we can bring in parts of their network, our system.
There being who?
So we have in this military kind of thing, the enemy, and we have us and them. And so one idea is like, well, we take parts of their network and kind of co-opt it.
Oh, yeah, like the counter, you know, the Sunni awakening.
You might want to bring in the kind of co-opter who's an entrepreneur who can
Uh-huh.
maybe then bring peace.
Yeah, that's, oh, yeah, in terms of the discussion about if you really knock out the insurgency, then there's nobody left to negotiate with. Yeah, so some of that has, yeah, that's a good point, and I think somebody needs to elaborate that. I don't have the spontaneity to do that right at this point. So, but thank you very much. I enjoyed the questions, and I hope you took away something thoughtful from this.